A black soldier just returned from deployment ready to finally go home, but when he steps into the airport, everything changes. A racist cop targets him, without cause humiliates him in front of others, and then just 7 minutes later, he's fired on the spot. What happened next shocked everyone, and set off a chain of events no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we start the story, comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from today, and if you find this story impactful, don't forget to subscribe for more. It was just an ordinary morning in Hollow Bend, the kind of town where the mist still lingered over the red dirt fields like breath from the earth itself. At the edge of that land, a man stood still, tall, broad-shouldered, with a presence that didn't demand attention but earned it. Elijah Briggs sipped his coffee on the porch of a farmhouse that had stood longer than the roads that now led tourists past it. To some, he was just an old farmer. Quiet, private, a little too proud. But beneath the denim and soil was a man shaped by war. Not just any war. Eli was Delta Force. A commander. A shadow in the stories soldiers didn't tell. And now, retired, he was supposed to be at peace. But peace, he'd learned, was not the absence of conflict. It was the absence of noise. And even that had its limits. The first time he saw the white truck, it crept past slowly. Tires rolling over gravel like a whisper that meant more than it said. No license plates. Windows blacked out. Just watching. Eli had seen eyes like that in Fallujah. The kind that scanned perimeters, mapped weaknesses. Predatory eyes. That truck passed again the next day. And the day after. He didn't call the police. Not because he didn't want help, but because he already knew what their answer would be. He had made the call years ago, when another group tried to intimidate a black neighbor out of their home. The sheriff came 2 days later, shrugged, and said, "No crime in looking." That neighbor left within the week. So when Eli found the flyer, a crude piece of propaganda fluttering against his barbed wire fence, he didn't need to read it to know what it meant. But he read it anyway. Preserve the heritage. Protect the homeland. In faint watermark behind the blood-red ink, a burning cross. He folded it silently and slipped it into the back pocket of his jeans. Didn't show Clara. Didn't tell anyone. He wasn't afraid. But he was alert. And there's a difference. This wasn't about him, not really. This was bigger. Across the valley, other black families were whispering the same things. Strange trucks at night, flyers, slurs spray-painted on church doors. No windows broken yet. No crosses lit yet. But the air had changed. And if you were raised on land your grandfather died planting, you learn to feel when the wind starts to turn. The worst part wasn't the threat. It was the silence. Pastor Roy stopped by before lunch, the brim of his hat crushed between his hands. "They're getting bold," he said. "Put M on the church doors. Like they want us to see it. Like they ain't afraid no more." Eli just nodded. "They're not just watching now," the pastor added. "They're daring us. Testing if we'll fight. Or if we'll fold." It wasn't the first time in history someone tried to rewrite ownership by intimidation. The names changed. The methods evolved. But the intention was always the same: fear. Fear to move. Fear to speak. Fear to stand. But what they didn't realize, what they always underestimated, was the patience of the people they tried to erase. Eli didn't retaliate that day. He checked the irrigation system, patrolled the fence line, repaired what had been cut. That evening, as he sat by Clara sipping coffee again, the same truck returned. This time it didn't pass. It stopped. 3 men stepped out. Boots first. Then flannel, denim, and smirks carved from centuries of unpunished arrogance. One of them spoke, slow and lazy. "You must be Briggs," he said, not asking. Just stating. Eli didn't answer. Didn't flinch. "We just came to talk," the man added, smile tight and eyes cold. "Folks round here like things familiar. Traditional. You understand." "I understand," Eli said quietly, "that you're trespassing." A beat. No guns were drawn. No fists raised. Just words. But the weight of it, like gravel loaded into the soul. Before they left, the man leaned in close. "Nice place you got here. Shame if it slipped away." And then they were gone. Just like that, the line was drawn. But it wasn't between men. It was between illusions. Between who they thought Eli was, and who he had trained his entire life to be. Because while they brought threats, Eli had been trained to neutralize nations. And while they brought silence, Eli knew that sometimes the loudest thing in a war is the pause before the storm. So he waited, and watched, and prepared. The next morning came cloaked in gray. Not the soft gray of rain or the restful hush of overcast skies, but a heavy gray that clung to the air like something watching, waiting. Eli stood once more on his porch, the same coffee in hand, the same gaze sweeping his land. But the land no longer answered with quiet. It had tension now, a static hum in the soil. He didn't need lightning to know a storm was coming. He could feel it in his bones, the same way he used to feel before missions, when silence wasn't safety, but setup. Clara noticed it first. Not the signs on the fence or the burn marks near the chicken coop. She noticed it in him. The way he moved, slower, more deliberate. The way he looked past her, not at her, like a man already hearing the sound of boots before they hit the dirt. "You've got that look again," she said, brushing her hand across his knuckles as he gripped the mug. "The one you used to wear when you came back from places you wouldn't talk about." Eli didn't respond right away. His eyes were fixed on the tree line, where the wind moved wrong, as if it was dodging something unseen. "I've been feeling it coming," he said finally. "Now it's here." The escalation came as it always does, not in full force, but in fragments. Pieces of a puzzle designed to make you question if you're imagining it. A wire clipped clean, not chewed like by animals. A horse missing, then found trembling near the creek, its eyes wide with something ancient. A light flickering that had never flickered before. Every detail small, each deniable. Together, undeniable. Then the knock came. 3 knocks, too confident for a neighbor, too calm for trouble. Eli opened the door to find Pastor Roy again. Only this time, the man didn't speak with concern. He spoke with fear. Real, quiet fear, the kind that's hard to name because naming it gives it power. "It's not just you," he said. "The Walkers, the Harrisons, even Miss Liza. They're getting the same visits, the same flyers. But now it's doors slamming at night. Lights outside the window. And Cobb? He says it's nothing. Sheriff Gentry Cobb." The name fell heavy in the room. Cobb had been in office for 16 years. A man who spoke slow, smiled like a postcard, and promised justice that never quite arrived. The kind of man who called himself neutral when injustice knocked on only one side of town. A man who wore his badge like armor and his silence like strategy. Eli had watched him grow bolder each year, not louder but less accountable. And now, when people were being hunted in plain sight, Cobb chose to vanish into paperwork. "He told me," Roy said, "that we shouldn't stir things up. Said maybe you're just being defensive." Eli's jaw clenched. Not in anger, but in calculation. Defensive. A word always weaponized against black men who dared to say, "I see what you're doing." To Cobb, preparation was paranoia. Boundaries were aggression. And watching your back was proof you were guilty of something. They wanted Eli to play along. To wait for the fire to get hot enough before he admitted he was being burned. But Eli knew better. He'd been trained in patterns. And this wasn't chaos. This was method. Psychological pressure first. Isolation second. Sabotage next. Then, once enough fear had spread, displacement. They wouldn't need to bulldoze the farms. They'd make the owners walk away on their own. That was the strategy. Push until dignity collapsed under fatigue. And the land? That was the prize. To them, land was legacy only when it was inherited by the right skin. Otherwise, it was an obstacle. Eli's farm wasn't just acres of dirt. It was history, resistance, proof that blood didn't always lose. They couldn't let that stand. Not now. Not with investors whispering about new roads, about development, about a future that didn't include families like Eli's. So they started small. But precision, not size, was the threat. That night, Eli didn't sleep. He walked the perimeter like a sentry, checking every corner, every sound. The night whispered secrets through the brush, but Eli didn't flinch. He was listening, counting, waiting. When he reached the north field, his favorite spot, the one where his grandfather first tilled soil with hands cracked from cotton and hope, he saw it. The gate was cut, not broken. Cut. Clean. Sharp. Surgical. The wire lay like a snake snapped in half. The post bent at an unnatural angle. And just beyond, hoof prints, too deep for a wild stray. Sweet Bay, his best mare, was gone. He followed the trail with the precision of a tracker. Over grass disturbed just enough to speak. Toward the pond, where he found Sweet Bay trembling, flanks heaving, eyes darting. Eli crouched low. Didn't speak. Just watched. This wasn't random. This wasn't boys out for mischief. This was the opening move. And they had no idea who they were playing with. When he led Sweet Bay home, Clara met him at the gate. She didn't ask questions. Didn't have to. Eli placed his hand on her shoulder, and for the first time in years, she felt his fingers tremble. Because war had come home. Not with uniforms, but with masks. With denial. With intention dressed up as misunderstanding. And Eli, who had trained to dismantle terror cells across oceans, was now preparing to defend a porch, a pasture, and the woman he loved. This wasn't about fear anymore. It was about dignity. And it was only just beginning. The fire started just before midnight. It came not with the roar of chaos, but the hiss of something planned, something quiet enough to make the silence complicit. Eli had been walking the southern edge of the property, flashlight low, senses sharpened to the unnatural stillness of a land no longer resting. He heard the pop before he saw the light, the kind of dull, compressed sound that only accelerant-soaked wood makes when it meets fire. A flash of orange flared against the horizon, unnatural and growing fast. The barn. He ran. Not like a man startled, but like a soldier activated, every step measured, precise. The grass was still wet with evening dew, but the heat cut through the night air like a wound splitting open. Smoke curled upward in slow, purposeful waves. This wasn't a spark from faulty wiring. This was ignition with intent. Accelerated. Targeted. Clara burst from the house in a shawl and slippers, her silhouette trembling in the doorframe as Eli skidded to a stop just outside the inferno. The barn was too far gone. Flames were crawling up the wooden ribs like red spiders, consuming everything. The sky above it pulsed red and black, as if the land itself was choking on rage. "No!" Clara shouted, running forward, but Eli caught her mid-stride, pulling her close. "Don't," he said, voice firm. "They want us to run into it. That's the bait." "They?" she asked, her eyes wide with a kind of grief that could not yet process who they were. Eli didn't answer. He didn't need to. The question had never been if, only when. He left her standing at the edge of the yard and walked toward the small shed behind the vegetable rows. Inside, behind a tarp and a row of tools dulled from time, was a locked steel cabinet. The lock clicked open with the ease of memory. Inside, a rifle. Matte black. Lightweight. Calibrated. Maintained, not because he expected war, but because he'd seen enough of the world to know peace was not permanent. He didn't load it right away. He just held it, let his breath steady, let the weight of it sink into his palms like old truth returning. Because this moment wasn't about retaliation. It was about declaration. They had made their second move. Now it was his turn. By sunrise, the barn was a skeleton, charred beams twisted against the pale light like ribs of some great beast hunted and left to rot. Smoke still lingered, rising in curls above the ashes. It didn't just smell of fire. It smelled of message, of marking. The same way he'd seen militias in Eastern Europe burn enemy checkpoints, not for strategy but symbolism. Burn the symbol, and you burn the spirit. But what they didn't understand was that the barn had never been the heart. The heart was still standing, still watching. As the morning deepened, trucks began to arrive. One by one, neighbors rolled in slowly. Walkers, Harrisons, Pastor Roy, even old Miss Liza, cane in hand, wrapped in her Sunday coat despite the heat. They stood not as victims but as witnesses, eyes wide, chests tight. They weren't just seeing what had happened. They were recognizing it, recognizing the pattern. "I spoke to Cobb," Pastor Roy said grimly, standing beside Eli as the smoke painted shadows across the yard. "He says faulty wiring." Eli didn't laugh. He didn't even scoff. He just stared ahead. Same way they said the Harrisons' tractor caught fire on its own last month. Or how the Walker boys' tools went missing but no report was filed. "This ain't mischief," Miss Liza whispered. "This is war." Again, the weight of that word hung in the air like cinders. Naomi Walker arrived next, camera in hand. Eyes not just documenting, but dissecting. A few years younger than Micah's mother, but already a respected investigative journalist, Naomi had grown up on these fields. Left for college. Returned with a fire not unlike the one that now smoldered behind Eli. "This isn't random," she said after one lap around the ruins. 3 other black-owned farms in the next county. Vandalism. Missing livestock. Fires. Same flyer left behind. She handed Eli a copy. The same burning cross watermark. The same sick message of heritage and preservation. But now, with the barn gone, the community could no longer pretend it wasn't real. Some still tried. "We shouldn't fight," said Mr. Harris, voice shaking. "We endured before. We can endure again." But endurance had cost too much already. 17-year-old Micah stepped forward, shirt wrinkled, fists clenched. A boy on the edge of manhood, carved by frustration. Endure until what? Until there's nothing left but ashes? His voice cracked, but it carried. The air thickened with a new weight, choice. Not between peace and war, but between silence and resistance. Eli said nothing for a long moment. Just listened to the tension rise. The young pressing forward. The elders holding back. The fear. The anger. The exhaustion. And then he raised his hand, calm, commanding. Like a man who didn't speak often, but when he did, the world slowed to hear it. This land, he said, voice even, is more than dirt and crops. It is legacy. It is memory. It is sacred. My grandfather picked cotton on land he later died owning. That's not just history. That's blood paid in full. The crowd stilled. I didn't fight overseas to surrender here, Eli continued. Not to men who burn barns in the dark and call it tradition. If they want war, they'll find us ready. But we won't fight like them. We fight for something, not against. We fight so no one else has to wonder what it means to be safe on their own soil. It was not a roar. It was not a cry. It was conviction. And that morning, beneath the skeleton of his past, Eli began to forge something new. Not just defense. Unity. Not just resistance. Strategy. Because they had burned wood. But they had not touched the roots. And in war, roots, hidden and deep, are what always survive. The next few days passed like a fuse slowly burning its way towards something inevitable. The ashes from the barn still clung to the wind, curling through Hollow Bend like whispers of a memory too fresh to forget. And yet, Sheriff Cobb remained silent. No statement. No follow-up. No investigation. Just a phone call to Pastor Roy the next morning, cool and dismissive. These things happen, he said. Maybe y'all ought to be more careful with your wiring. That sentence traveled through the black community like poison. Not just because it was a lie, but because it was the kind of lie designed to insult your intelligence while erasing your pain. The kind of lie meant to push you so close to rage that when you finally did fight back, they'd say, "See? That's the problem." Cobb wasn't just complicit. He was strategic. Because silence wasn't neutrality. It was alignment. Naomi, however, didn't stay silent. She returned to Eli's farm 3 days after the fire with a manila folder thick with documents, her eyes sharp and urgent. She didn't knock. Just walked straight to the barn, what was left of it, and opened the file across a folding table. "Eli," she said, "you need to see this." Inside were land deeds. Copies of titles. Official paperwork showing ownership transfers for farms across the county. At first glance, they looked normal. But Naomi had learned to look deeper. "They're forged," she said flatly. Eli didn't speak. He didn't blink. He just stared at the ink like it had betrayed him personally. Naomi pointed to a signature. "Walker property. Transferred last month to a company that doesn't exist in any database. And here, that's Miss Liza's land. Same pattern. Transferred. Filed. Gone. Who's behind the company?" Eli asked, voice low and controlled. "That's the thing," Naomi said. "It's a shell. But if you trace the transactions, the same notary shows up in nearly all of them. Connected to a courthouse in the next county. And if you go back far enough, Cobb's name is on the oversight board that approved the zoning changes 3 years ago. It wasn't just intimidation anymore. It was theft. Legal theft, dressed in paperwork and executed in silence. The Red Thorns, who burned, who threatened, who screamed about tradition, were just foot soldiers. The real war was being fought in folders and filing cabinets. And Cobb wasn't looking the other way. He was holding the door open. Eli closed the folder and took a long breath. So this was the plan. Drive them out. Intimidate those who wouldn't sell. Buy the rest for pennies through forged deeds. And when the land was clear, build something new, something clean, marketable, profitable. A highway expansion. An industrial zone. Maybe a shopping center. Something that erased every footprint that came before it. And if the families pushed back, blame the flames on bad wiring. Micah and 3 other teens returned from patrol that afternoon, covered in sweat and dirt. They'd been walking the southern edge, checking fence lines, when they heard a sharp pop beneath the weeds. Smoke canisters erupted in front of them, thick, acrid clouds that stung the eyes and choked the lungs. Then came the ambush, for masked men armed with bats and chains charging from the treeline. It wasn't just kids playing soldier anymore. This was escalation. Eli heard the commotion before he saw it. He moved like instinct, rifle slung but unused, body low and fast, every motion precise. He found the teens crouched near the creek bed, coughing, bloodied, but alive. One of them had a fractured wrist. Another, a gash near the temple. Micah stood over them, breathing heavy, fists clenched, a branch still in his hand. One attacker tried to charge again, desperate, cornered, but Eli caught him mid-swing, twisted the pipe from his grip, and drove his knee into the man's chest. The rest scattered into the smoke. The boys watched in awe, pain mingled with revelation. This wasn't a man trying to defend a farm. This was a tactician orchestrating survival. War wasn't just coming. It was here. And it wasn't going to be won by waiting. Back at the house, Clara cleaned wounds while Eli reinforced windows and replaced perimeter wiring. Naomi sat quietly nearby, uploading files. No one spoke for a while. There was nothing left to say. Later that night, Eli gathered them all inside the barn, his neighbors, his allies, his students. The barn had become more than a place to store tools. It was now a war room. They're not trying to scare us anymore, he said. They're trying to erase us. The silence in the room was thick. But we're not going anywhere. He pointed to the map, now pinned to the wall, marked with routes, watch posts, rotation schedules. This isn't about retaliation. It's about survival. About legacy. We fight not because we want war, but because we want to keep the right to live in peace. Micah nodded. Naomi recorded. Clara handed out food. And something began to shift. A people long taught to keep their heads down began to raise them. Not out of arrogance, but out of necessity. Because when the system that's supposed to protect you joins the ones who hunt you, you stop knocking on doors. You start building your own. The lines had been drawn. And Eli Briggs, quiet, deliberate, haunted Eli, had become something else. Not a veteran. Not a farmer. But a general. And this land was no longer just home. It was the front line. The sun never really rose that morning. It bled. A dull red horizon hung over Hollow Bend, casting the fields in a bruised amber light that seemed to know what was coming. The air was too still. Even the birds, usually defiant in the face of storms, had gone silent. Eli stood at the edge of the field, boots planted, body squared, rifle slung across his shoulder like an extension of his spine. He wasn't tense. He was ready. He didn't need reports. He didn't need warnings. He could feel it. War doesn't knock. It enters. The signal came at 6:47 a.m. Naomi, perched on the roof of the general store, pressed the mic clip to her collar. Movement from the ridge, she said, calm and clear. 8 trucks. Confirmed. All loaded. Micah, standing near the main gate with 3 other boys, didn't flinch. He looked over at Eli, who gave a single nod. That was all they needed. They scattered into position like drops of water into dry soil, seamless, fast, invisible. The trucks tore down the dirt road like wolves in formation, big, loud, armored with intent. They didn't come with flags. They didn't need them. The black vests, the gloves, the metal pipes, the baseball bats wrapped in tape, the rifles slung low like casual accessories. Those were flags enough. The red thorns had come to end it. What they didn't know was that Eli had already decided it would end on his terms. The first truck breached the outer fence and hit the trap immediately. A wire stretched low across the entry point snapped taut, releasing a cascade of flash powder, pepper, and chalk. The explosion was bright but non-lethal, designed not to maim, but to confuse, to disorient. The men stumbled back, eyes burning, coughing. Before they could regroup, Micah's unit moved in. Silent, efficient, trained. They used staffs, not guns. Not yet. One swing at the knees, another at the ribs, and the first group of attackers was down, not dead but humiliated. And humiliation, Eli knew, was more destabilizing than injury. Another truck peeled off to the east, heading toward the Taylor property. They thought they'd flank the defenders. Instead, they drove straight into a trench hidden under brush, the front axle cracking in half on impact. When they spilled out, scrambling, Isaiah and 2 veterans waited. No words. No warning. Just movement, sharp, controlled, final. At the heart of it all, Eli moved like wind in tall grass, silent but powerful. One attacker lunged at him with a crowbar. Eli ducked under the arc of the swing, stepped into the man's chest, and drove him backward with a shoulder slam that lifted him clean off the ground. Another came from behind, wild, screaming, sloppy. Eli turned, caught the arm, twisted, dropped the man with a single calculated elbow. The red thorns had expected resistance. They had not expected choreography. This wasn't panic. It was execution. A town that had once bowed its head was now lifting it, together, methodically. Then the voice cut through it all. Briggs! Caleb Knox stood atop the lead truck, shirt half unbuttoned, eyes red-rimmed and burning with something between hatred and desperation. He leapt down, landing with a grunt, pistol in hand. "You think this changes anything?" he shouted, storming toward Eli. "You think this little rebellion makes you more than what you are? This land was never yours." Eli stepped forward, eyes calm, steps slow. "This land was worked by our hands," he said. "It was passed down through our blood. You don't get to rewrite that." "You should have taken the offer," Caleb spat, raising his gun. "Should have walked away like your kind always does." "You never made an offer," Eli replied. "Only a threat." And then Eli did something no one expected. He took off the rifle, let it fall to the ground, stepped forward with empty hands. "If you're going to shoot," he said, "do it now. But I promise you, if you don't, you'll regret the next 10 seconds of your life." Caleb's hand trembled. Rage warred with fear. And then, with a grunt of something between pride and self-destruction, he charged. Fist first. Eli met him halfway. The first punch missed. The second didn't. Eli took it across the cheek, staggered for a breath, then countered, a hook to the ribs, a knee to the thigh. They locked arms, stumbled into the dirt, fists flying. Around them, the battle stilled. Even the attackers paused, eyes drawn to the center of the storm where two men, one built by privilege, one by discipline, collided. Caleb fought dirty. He went for the eyes, the throat, the knees. Eli fought smart. He deflected, redirected, dismantled. After 4 minutes, Caleb's strikes grew sluggish. His face bloodied, his strength waning. Eli stood over him, chest heaving, arms bruised, jaw swelling. "You want this land?" Eli said, his voice steel. "Then bleed into it, like we did." And with one final blow, an elbow to the temple, Caleb fell. The silence that followed was not peace. It was reckoning. Around the battlefield, red thorns dropped their weapons. Some tried to run. Most didn't bother. The community had closed in, shoulder to shoulder. Not with pitchforks. With presence. With unity. And then came the sirens. Not Cobb's. These were different. State troopers. Real law. Real consequence. Naomi had sent everything, video, audio, confession, and the cavalry arrived. Sheriff Cobb stood at the edge of the property, sunglasses removed, his face a pale canvas of defeat. An officer approached him with the words, "Sheriff Gentry Cobb, you are under investigation. Step forward." Cobb didn't. He ran. But not far. And when they dragged him back in cuffs, the community didn't cheer. They didn't jeer. They just watched. Quiet. Measured. The way people do when they've seen too much to be surprised anymore. Later, as Clara tended to the wounded and Jalen swept the ash from the porch, Eli stood in the middle of the scorched field. He looked around, not at the damage, but at the people. At what they had chosen. They hadn't won because they fought. They had won because they stayed. They didn't burn back. They endured. Together. And when Clara walked over and asked, "Is it over?" He shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "But it's turning. And sometimes that's more powerful than a victory. It's a beginning." The fires had died, but the smoke lingered, not in the sky but in the people. In the eyes of children who woke at night to the memory of sirens and boots. In the tightness of shoulders that hadn't fully unclenched. In the pauses between conversations, when neighbors looked over their shoulders before speaking freely. Hollow Bend was no longer a battlefield, but it wasn't yet a home again. Peace, Eli knew, didn't come when the violence stopped. It came when the fear no longer lived in your breath. So even after Caleb Knox was dragged away in shackles, even after Sheriff Cobb's mugshot ran in 3 different newspapers, Eli kept moving. Every morning began with rounds, checking fences, walking the perimeter, testing motion sensors. Every night ended with community check-ins. Radios were passed out house to house. Patrol schedules rotated. Everyone had a role now. The town had become more than a group of survivors. It had become a living network, watchful, prepared, resilient. But that resilience was being tested again. It started with little things. 3 tires slashed in one night, all from trucks parked on black-owned farms. A mailbox stuffed with animal entrails. Fences broken, not all at once, but piece by piece, like something trying to sneak back in through the cracks. Poisoned livestock feed at the walkers. A cross carved, not burned, but etched deep, into the church's wooden doors. These weren't random. These were messages. But unlike before, the red thorns didn't come roaring down dirt roads. They slithered. Cowards in camouflage. Ghosts clinging to shadows. And Cobb? Gone from his badge, but not from his influence. Naomi had dug deeper. A new shell company had formed just weeks after Cobb's arrest, this time tied to a cousin of one of the zoning commissioners. Same goal, acquiring land cheap, fast, and quiet. And the buyers were circling again, offering exit packages to families under pressure. This wasn't just a backlash. It was a counteroffensive, smarter, quieter, more dangerous. When they couldn't win by force, they'd win by fatigue. That's what Eli feared most. Not bullets, not fire, but exhaustion. Because fear doesn't always break you. Sometimes it just wears you down until standing still feels easier than pushing forward. So he changed tactics. Instead of only preparing for war, he began preparing for endurance. He taught teenagers how to spot surveillance patterns. He taught the older men how to sweep for trackers on their trucks. He trained the women in emergency response, how to carry the wounded, how to reinforce door frames, how to hold your ground when no one was coming. This isn't about becoming soldiers, Eli told them one night as they sat under lanterns behind Miss Liza's barn. It's about remembering that no one saves us but us. Micah had grown in those weeks. His face sharper now, the roundness of youth burned away by adrenaline and responsibility. One evening, while repairing a fence near the creek, he pulled Eli aside. "They chased my sister," he said, voice trembling. "She was just walking from school. They drove by, shouted names I can't even say out loud. She ran all the way home." Eli didn't answer right away. He reached out and placed a hand on Micah's shoulder. "This is what they want," Eli said. "To scare her. To scare you. Because if they can scare us, they don't have to shoot us. They win without blood. So how do we fight that?" Micah asked. "By refusing to become like them," Eli replied. "We fight with preparation, with discipline, with unity. That's how we win. That's how we outlive them." Micah nodded, something behind his eyes hardening, not with vengeance, but with clarity. That night, the farm transformed again. Patrols doubled. Defensive perimeters reinforced. The old church bell was rewired to a radio-triggered system. If the alarm rang 3 times, every house would know it was time to move. But not everyone agreed with Eli's strategy. Some of the older men, those who had lived through the civil rights years, urged caution. "Don't push too far," one said during a town meeting. "We made it this far by surviving, by being smart." "We're not asking for war," Pastor Roy added gently. "Just to be left alone." But Naomi, standing near the back with her notebook, shook her head. "They won't leave us alone," she said. "Because leaving us alone means letting us live without fear. And that's what they can't stand." She stepped forward and laid a photograph on the table. It was Caleb Knox and Cobb, smiling outside a courthouse. Not long before the first fire. Behind them, blueprints, construction plans, expansion corridors. "They never wanted the land just for hate," Naomi said. "They want it for money. But hate is what they use to clear the path." The room went still. Naomi looked at Eli. "What do we do?" Eli looked around, at the faces weathered by labor, lined with grief, sharpened by memory. "We document," he said. "Every threat, every truck, every voice. We don't shout back. We record. We don't retaliate. We build." He placed his hand over the photograph. "They built their movement in the dark. We'll destroy it in the light." And so the strategy evolved. Cameras went up, disguised as bird feeders, weather sensors, power boxes. Naomi trained teenagers to upload footage every night. Clara started an anonymous tip line, and suddenly the town began to speak. Whispers from gas stations, license plate numbers, names. By week's end, Eli had a folder, thicker than Naomi's first, filled with evidence. Of trespassing, harassment, fraud. Enough to bury the men behind the curtain. But something changed in Eli too. He began to feel the weight, not just of leadership, but of inheritance. He wasn't just protecting a farm anymore. He was holding up a history that had always been targeted, but never erased. One night, walking alone through the northern field, he stopped. The stars were out, the sky vast and untouched. And he whispered aloud to the dark, "You still here, Granddad?" The breeze shifted, a warm one, as if the land answered. And in that moment, Eli understood. This wasn't just resistance. It was restoration. They weren't defending what had been stolen. They were reclaiming what had always been theirs. And no fire, no badge, no bullet forged in fear could ever uproot that. The night it finally broke open began like any other. Calm. Measured. Too quiet. The kind of silence Eli had learned long ago wasn't peace. It was prelude. He stood by the porch with Clara, both of them watching the ridge. The moon was high, silver and sharp, casting everything in a pale glow. The crops were steady in the wind, whispering secrets the earth had heard before. Eli's hand rested near the radio clipped to his hip, his other hand gently gripping Clara's. No words passed between them. None were needed. Then came the signal. A single blink of light from the church steeple. 3 short pulses. Naomi's code. They're coming. Eli responded with a single word into the walkie. Positions. And across Hollow Bend, the quiet became kinetic. Teenagers slid into the tall grass, walkie-talkies in hand. Elders locked gates and lit lanterns. Naomi posted up on the roof of the general store, camera mounted, lens focused. Clara moved calmly inside, securing the doors, her breath steady, face solemn but unafraid. Eli moved through the fields like a current. No panic. No shouting. Every motion rehearsed. Every contingency already imagined. He had spent his life preparing for chaos. He didn't fear it. He arranged it. From the north, the red thorns came like thunder, 8 trucks deep, tires ripping through the dirt like claws through flesh. The headlights sliced through the fields, casting long, monstrous shadows. They were shouting this time. They wanted to be heard. To remind the town that hate didn't vanish, it regrouped. The trucks split into 3 flanks, east, west, and center. Military formation, but without discipline. They poured out of the vehicles in mismatched gear, ski masks, hunting jackets, tactical gloves. One man carried a flag, some twisted version of history stitched in black and white, waving like a challenge. But Hollow Bend wasn't the same town they tried to burn. And Eli Briggs was no longer just defending. He was commanding. The east flank hit first. They approached the Taylor property with speed, hoping to overwhelm. But before they reached the fence, a mine of tin cans and tripwires erupted, crashing against metal drums, releasing a sound like gunfire. Lights snapped on. Powder traps burst, flooding the air with chalk and cayenne. The men coughed, stumbled, blinded and disoriented. 2 teens emerged from behind hay bales, staffs ready, and dropped the first wave with sharp, disabling blows. To the west, another group crept toward Miss Liza's house, expecting silence. Instead, one of them triggered a pepper bomb hidden beneath a flower pot. It exploded in red powder, coating them in sting and confusion. They ran blindly into a net of barbed wire laced through the orchard. But it was the center, Eli's field, they truly believed they could take. They were wrong. Eli met them alone. He stood just beyond the main fence line, calm, still unarmed. He wanted them to see what they could never defeat. Caleb Knox emerged from the lead truck, face flushed, wild-eyed, fists clenched. "This ends tonight," he screamed. "Yes," Eli said. "It does." The first red thorn lunged, bat raised high. Eli sidestepped, twisted, slammed his palm into the man's chest. Another came from behind. Eli caught the arm, spun, dropped him to the ground. But then Caleb charged. Straight at Eli. No weapon. Just rage. They collided in the dirt, fists flying, knees striking, breath shallow and fast. It wasn't clean. It wasn't choreographed. It was survival. Around them the battle roared. Micah's team intercepted 2 attackers near the silo, driving them back with speed and coordination. Isaiah and the veterans held the northern gate, their movements practiced, efficient. Naomi's camera captured everything, every blow, every scream, every act of courage. Caleb fought with desperation. Eli fought with intention. A punch to the ribs. A cut across the cheek. Caleb grabbed a rock, swung wide. Eli ducked. Grabbed his wrist. Twisted. The rock fell. And so did Caleb. Eli stood over him, breathing hard, jaw bleeding, one eye swelling shut. "You brought fire to our doors," he said. "But we became steel." From behind. One last attacker emerged, rifle raised. Eli turned. No time to react. But a figure moved faster. Micah. He tackled the man from behind, knocking the rifle loose. It fired once, into the dirt. The man fought back, screaming, kicking, but Micah didn't let go. He held him down, bloodied but unbroken. When Eli pulled the rifle away, he looked at Micah, not as a boy anymore, but as an heir. The town didn't cheer. They didn't celebrate. They stood. Still. Unshaken. Survivors, yes. But more than that, witnesses to their own unerasure. Then the sound came. Sirens. Real ones. State Patrol. Not summoned by plea, but by proof. Naomi's footage had already gone live. Across the state, across the country, people were watching. Sheriff Cobb was already in custody, but this was deeper now. This wasn't just about a gang. It was about a system. As the red thorns were zip-tied and lined up, eyes swollen, pride fractured, a silence fell over Hollow Bend. Not the silence of fear, the silence of turning. A moment between before and after. Eli looked out over his land, scorched in places, scarred in others, but still here. He walked to Clara, who stood just outside the porch light, hands trembling. He took her hand. "I think," she whispered, "they finally heard us." "No," Eli said, voice quiet. "They finally saw us. And that changed everything. Because once the truth is seen, it cannot be unseen. And once a community stands, it cannot be bent. Not by fire. Not by law. Not by history. Only by choice." And Hollow Bend had made its choice. Winter arrived like a hush across the land, soft but undeniable. The first frost settled on the scorched edges of the southern fence where once a burning cross had stood, now replaced by quiet soil and newly planted rows. Hollow Bend no longer moved with fear, but with intention. The air no longer carried the acrid sting of smoke, but the scent of pine and cedar, mixed with the churned breath of earth preparing to rest. The war, as the world had called it, had ended. But Eli Briggs knew better. The war hadn't ended. It had transformed. Justice had arrived in stages. Naomi's footage spread like wildfire, first locally then nationally. Footage of Red Thorn's screaming slurs, of children defending homes, of Sheriff Cobb in cuffs, of Caleb Knox's arrest, of elders standing shoulder to shoulder in silence, not seeking vengeance, but demanding truth. It shook something loose in the national conversation. Civil rights organizations descended. State and federal investigations opened. Red Thorns were labeled domestic terrorists. Properties were seized. Shell companies dismantled. Names that once commanded quiet fear were now uttered only with shame. But none of that changed Hollow Bend overnight. Eli understood something that many on the outside didn't. Victory wasn't in the arrests. It wasn't in headlines or courtrooms. Victory was in what the community chose to build after. Because hate doesn't die in handcuffs. It hides. It waits. And it watches to see if you're too tired to keep standing. So they stood taller. The old feed store was rebuilt brick by brick into something new. A schoolhouse, named not after a politician or historical figure, but after Clara. Clara Briggs' Schoolhouse for Community Learning. Because it had been her hands, quiet and constant, that stitched the community together in the silent moments between battles. In that schoolhouse, children of every background learned side by side. Elders came in the evenings for literacy classes. On weekends, Naomi hosted story circles, where old voices told truths never printed in books, of land earned through sweat, of songs passed down through broken chains, of roots that stretched beyond erasure. Naomi won a National Journalism Award for her reporting. She wore a plain black dress to the ceremony and accepted with a simple message. "I didn't write a story. I recorded a testimony. They did the rest." Micah turned 18 and enlisted. Not because he wanted to fight, but because Eli had shown him that service wasn't about war, it was about protection. The night before he left, he and Eli stood side by side, watching the stars rise. "I'm scared," Micah said quietly. "Good," Eli replied. "That means you care enough to come back." He placed his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Never forget where you came from, and never mistake silence for peace." Micah nodded, jaw tight. "You think they'll come back?" Eli stared out at the horizon. "They always do. But next time, they won't find us waiting. They'll find us standing." When spring thawed the fields, they gathered near the northern gate, where the worst scars had been left. The place where the final assault had begun, where fire once tried to bury them. Eli knelt and planted a tree, an oak, young but strong. Beside it, they placed a stone. No names, no dates, just 5 words: "We are still here." That night, under string lights and the flicker of lanterns, the town gathered. Not to celebrate, but to remember, to recommit. They shared food and stories. Children danced barefoot. Elders laughed the kind of laughter that only comes after surviving something meant to destroy you. Clara moved through the crowd like a thread, tying every conversation together with warmth. Later, when the crowd began to drift away and the music softened, she joined Eli on the porch, resting her head against his shoulder. "You think it's really over?" she asked. "No," Eli said, "but I think we've finally begun." She smiled gently. "You ever think about what would have happened if you sold the land?" He didn't answer for a long time. Then quietly, "Sometimes. But then I look at this, and I know my grandfather didn't pick cotton for nothing. He didn't walk back from war just to be pushed out by cowards in suits. He looked down at the fields, planted anew, lined with stronger fences, protected by trust instead of fear. This land remembers who loved it, he said. Clara slipped her hand into his. And it loves back. The stars were thick above them now. Not just stars, reminders. Of things buried but not forgotten. Of people lost but not erased. Of a future not promised but possible. And somewhere beneath the soil, in roots deeper than hate could ever reach, the truth bloomed. They had not fought for land. They had fought for belonging. For visibility. For each other. And they had won. Not through fire. Not through vengeance. But through the quiet, radical act of staying. Of refusing to leave. Of planting themselves in a place the world said they didn't belong and saying, with every breath, we do. And now, they would never be driven from it again.